Hello everyone, today we talk about the Habsburgic dynastic possessions before the 30 Years' War. We observed the Alpländer, and today we discuss Bohemia. Also Hungary introductively will be likely our next chapter for this Habsburgic history series, and of course we will come back on them unavoidably for all what would be going on in the 17th and the 18th century. Without mentioning that, of course, these are two countries that I extensively covered as far as their medieval history is concerned, as you well know, and we will keep naturally talking more frequently too on these for my medieval history and warfare too. Of course, in any case, you know where to check for the playlists about, in fact, Bohemian and Hungarian history, not just about the Middle Ages, but comprehensively. And again, those are all segmented also by years if you prefer. So it's important to talk about Bohemia and Hungary together today. Again, I focus on the first, but for many reasons that have to do, as we will see now, with the background of these countries, not just how the Habsburgs had acquired them, right? They had been essentially realms established for over half of a millennium when the Habsburgs acquired them in the years 1526-27. Both Central European countries, they were, however, very different in other ways. They had been the fruit of, in fact, different types of conquest, tribal, in a way confederal, in another, depending to the extent also of our original understanding. Bohemia had been founded by the Slavic Czechs and other groups, naturally, who had arrived in the land likely as early as the 6th century. We observed this, especially in the videos about the Longobard history. This is, we will see, especially true for Moravia rather than Bohemia. But here we're talking about the crown lands of Bohemia that, as you know, had encompassed Moravia from quite a while. While Hungary had been conquered by the Magyars, an Ugro-Finnic people who had migrated in the 9th century on the Pannonian Basin and the Middle Danube, and that was established differently from Bohemia, that coalesced a bit like Poland from, yes, let's say the hegemonic rise of one of the tribes, but still over a confederal basis. But this is an empire proper over the populations surrounding, in fact, the Magyar areas of settlement, mostly in the Carpathian Basin, that were also Slavic, right? And there were actually other ethnicities there from before. Think about the Avars that had been crushed by the Franks. There were Romance peoples. There were other, say, relics of Germanic populations and so on. In any case, this profile of the two countries varied substantially in the moment of the foundation. Bohemia fundamentally developed as together with Moravia, that was part of its crown lands, in fact, and originally just ruled by the same dynasty within the kingdom, as in fact a quite compact, tidy Western Slavic country that, a bit thanks to the geographical sheltering, the relatively small size, and the close proximity of the Frankish Germanic Empire, acquired quite early on a markedly, in fact, Western profile. At least was the Central European country that was influenced the most by German culture. Hungary was a bit different because, first of all, it was this sizable empire between Constantinople and the Germanic Reich that had, like Poland, actually escaped the inclusion within the Holy Roman Empire when the Dutch and later the Kingdom of Bohemia was actually integrated in the Germanic Empire, becoming actually one of the electors, properly, of the German rulers right? As if that had been a chunk, right, of the same country in a cultural sense. Both countries had important native dynasties, respectively the Przemyslids and the Arpads, that had a bit like the Piasts in Poland. There are different parallelisms. Now we stick mostly to the two, but Central European countries have a bit this similar characteristics, right? Germany is slightly exceptional, right? But these are all countries would head, as we will see now, towards an elective monarchy in which essentially the nobility managed to take over at some point, with actually great problems, right, for the same administration of these countries, as we will see. But allowing, in that sense, this practice, right, of installing foreign dynasties to rule their country, right? This is a thing that every medievalist knows in the intimate mechanism, right? The idea is that since these were, in a way, really failed states, right? The monarchy tried to concentrate power, but fundamentally failed, differently from Western European national monarchies that at the end of the day establish a true state that brought the country further. These countries, especially Hungary in this case, went into the hands of very powerful oligarchs that, especially in the provincial dimension, were sort of kinglets on their own, and that avoiding to have just one of them, right, rising over the others, and they were quite paranoid about this because they had been struggling against this native royal dynasties for a long time. They would call somebody else from the external. This wouldn't reduce all the problems for the oligarchs. Actually, all the dynasties that succeeded in this country at some point became very powerful on their own. Think about the Luxembourgs in Bohemia, the Angevins in Hungary. Then you have you really have a politically institutionally passionate struggle that substantially makes these realms still say updated and potentially savable, right? Or entities until the end of the Middle Ages, when in fact the entire system collapsed, right? And much of this has to do why they were essentially occupied by the Habsburgs, and in the case of Hungary by the Turks. So again, different stories. We're not here to make the medieval history of both, just to talk about actually early modern Bohemia. But this background is fundamental, because the latter had lost 1/3 of its population at the beginning of the 15th century. I mean, there was a major disaster. By the 14th century, Bohemia was truly the heart of medieval Europe, at least in a sense of political prestige and grandeur, given that the current Holy Roman Emperors, the Luxembourgs, ruled from Prague. That was truly an international city, keeping itself, thanks to this also in fact partly foreign management, of a quite updated court administrative system. It was really at the center of Europe, also in a ideally geographical but especially cultural sense, and yet this system was to go downhill because in part of the crisis of mid-14th century. I looked at this in a video that is titled like the social background to the Hussite Wars. The latter of which, however, were the real problem, right? Made several videos about the Hussites, but not quite explaining something about the Bohemian diet in that regard, showing how a different elite came to power, sort of ethnic one that had not really much to do with the modern national sense of the thing, but rather the fact that, again, there was as always, a centrifugal force to try to escape more pressuring and somehow establish government. In the process, the country went literally destroyed. Right, this was a major disaster of epochal scale. Right, pop culture also on YouTube fixates mostly with the accomplishments of the Hussites on the battlefield that are praisable, but also to be contextualized in that particular Central European reality without showing the complete destruction of the country, the fact again that lots of people had to abandon it. Sure, there is an Hussite legacy a bit in the Protestant rebellism later on in the same Germany, because there are lots of Czechs, also lots of, in fact, Hussites fled together with their, again, also resistant guerrillas and more, experience matured during this devastating wars. And of course, Hussitism didn't quite die out, right? Bohemia at a point was ruled even by a Hussite, thus heretical monarch, right? George of Podebrady, that was belonging, as we will see, the Podebradys here, that were one of the families that still retained great power in the Bohemian crownlands, that as a result of this collapse would privatize dramatically, with great difficulties for the Habsburgs, because they somehow escaped at that point the pressuring force, scattered, say, in places where it was also difficult, fundamentally centralized, right? Both Bohemia and Hungary essentially exhausted themselves at some point. There were some lands contended between Bohemia and Poland, namely, you can watch that video about medieval Silesia that is quite telling. Initially, you have these two powers wrestling. Then, mid-14th century crisis, all the issues going on. This thing, as most of Eurasia, basically exhausts moral and material resources, and everything privatizes locally, and there is just a heraldic mess, right, ruling instead of strong monarchies that are taken over again by others, right? Hungary at some point had invaded the same Bohemia, had invaded the same Austria, telling the truth, as we've seen. They had Matthias Corvinus and his Black Army, about which I made, I made a video specifically about that, but also about the late medieval Hungarian army organization, right, that tells more about it. Had occupied the same Vienna, right? Frederick III of Habsburg had to flee the city. So you really have lots of things going on, because at some point all these major Central European monarchies were tending dynastically to be cumulated by a single person or single ruler. And the purpose was, again, the aforementioned one. From one side, from the oligarchs, to maintain their privileges, not having this greatly pressuring king, but the latter still being based on one of the kingdoms and receiving, say, not much surplus from each kingdom, and definitely as a sum enough to try to centralize in a given kingdom. And it's a bit what the Habsburgs end up doing, right? Because the major dynasties here fundamentally go extinct, right? The native ones had gone so in Bohemia and Hungary by the 14th century. Again, were substituted by foreign ones, as we just said, right? The Hungarian collapse occurs mostly because of the Ottoman pressure, but it wasn't only that. It was literally this oligarchic fragmentation of the country. The Black Army that we just mentioned was actually an effort by the great humanist king Matthias Corvinus with a very energetic policy to try to keep things together, but with a great permeability of the country, and ultimately the collapse after his death, right? And it was a very heavily strained system, and also pretty large, and thus very difficult one to govern. So the Ottomans managed, as you know, to crush the Hungarians at the Battle of March. We'll see it later, but the important being for today's video is that the Bohemian and Hungarian crowns had been collected under a single dominion, first under Ladislas Jagiellon between 1491 and 1516. This was the dynasty of essentially also Poland, Lithuania, as you know, that had installed itself after the extinction of the PS. Yes, it was also in there an Angevin interludium. But and especially the ill-fated Louis II, ruling from 1516 to 1526, that being killed in the same Battle of March by the Turks, basically was leaving this enormous legacy. At that point, the Habsburgs actually were always trying to handle themselves into pressure from everybody involved, right? The Austrian-Hungarian rivalry had always been a thing. In part, there was already at that point, as you know, with Ferdinand in Austria and Charles V in Spain, de facto a quite complicated management, say, of interests, of reinforcements of troops that were to be sent in aid under the greater pressure, but still being subtracted from other theaters. So much so that Hungary, that had always been a rival, collapsed. The Turks took essentially a third of the country. Then there would be another one that would be under their vassalage of some sort. It was still run by Hungarians, but also developing, as you know, historically, this fact, at least anti-Habsburgic character, becoming Protestant, Calvinist, etc. And another third that was so-called Royal Hungary, ruled by the Habsburgs themselves. And I made lots of videos, especially about the 17th century, about this, all the political, international, diplomatic context preceding Vienna, 1683, the second Ottoman siege of the city that actually had followed to the one that just after the fall of Hungary, in fact, had in the same 1527 being carried out, failing, but still showing essentially what the Ottoman threat was about for Central Europe, evidently. The most important thing about Bohemia that now we concentrate on is the fact that this was really a large system, right? Germany was, as you know, hyper-fragmented from a political point of view, and historically this country had managed at some point to even hegemonize the same German affairs. Look at what happened under Ottokar II Przemysl, that really conquered southeastern Germany. He arrived up to the Adriatic. Think about Charles IV of Luxembourg, that really was, again, embodying that true heart of 14th century Europe, also connected internationally with the rest of the imperial lands up to the Mediterranean. So lots of stuff, and still at this point, after all, even though the Habsburgs had managed to put back together all their various assets from the previous split in various dynasties that either died out or were reunited under Frederick III, were quite heterogeneous, right? We've seen them. The Alpländer and their nature was quite composite, right? Bohemia was actually much bigger than the same Austria, and as such, even though it had again lost much of its not much of its governability per se, but at least the possibility of having a strong state from which retaking a bit like the national reins by, say, maybe the natives, was of course brought under. This allowed, of course, a great decentralization, but constituted an enormous pool of manpower and agricultural resources that just were quite precious in the time being, like most pre-industrial societies, right? So the Habsburgs had this quite ungrateful task of coping with two kingdoms, or at least in the case of Hungary, what remained of it, that had, however, enjoyed a well-defined historical identity, right? So with traditionally their constituent nobilities, right, that would elect, in the case, Ferdinand of Habsburg as king, right, of the countries, and that were also more complex, right, bigger, and in this sense more complicated to handle at the point. Think about the beginning of the 30 Years' War, than what had been, at least tendentially, the more fateful Alpländer, that at some point would see, peasant revolts, all this kind of things, but still were more of a properly a Habsburgic German thing, right? And even about that, there would be a lot because, I don't know, definitely Austria is not Vorarlberg, or Tyrol is not Styria, and, etc. But at least had historically been part of this, especially Habsburgic grouping mechanism from quite a while. They belonged to the Kingdom of Germany, had another story, and other influences. I don't want to make too much romanticism about this all, but again, the sense that Central European history provides you with this much more differently patterned cultural background than more set national states that were affirming themselves in Western Europe at this time. And so the fact that this world was more just like Central Europe had historically been, more agricultural, less urbanized, less, more sparsely populated, less connected, and so a bit more archaic, a bit more primitive, and as such, still bearing the sign of, for example, traditional feudalism and political institutional balance. And so something that the Habsburgs had to cope with that, the Habsburgs of Austria that the series is dedicated to handle very differently from what you see, say, I don't know, the French, the English, the Spanish, in spite of all the problems that they still had, because those weren't, absolute states that wouldn't exist until actually the 19th century. Like the age of absolutism that we call like this had actually nothing to do with any form of absolute power, which is the actual deal of the whole thing, right? But let's not make further references to this, even though that's what we're discussing today. So, focusing specifically on the Bohemian crownlands, these lay essentially immediately north of the Erbländer, and they consisted of essentially 5 principalities as a whole, that can be, however, thought of as 2 specific regions, right? So the Bohemian kingdom had been developing within a very specific geographical boundary, right? The lands of the Boiaenum, the Marcomanni, the other peoples that up to, in fact, the Slavic invasion that had settled there had essentially been developing within this basin, circumcluded by a series of heavily forested mountains, encased also further by a hilly terrain, right? That did not just include Bohemia historically, but also the Margravate of Moravia, right? The former was the first duchy and kingdom within the Holy Roman Empire. The latter was just a Margravate, but it had it's on its own. In theory, I made a video about medieval Moravia, as a matter of fact. That for the historical region series, I covered all the stuff in some depth. That was, however, always ruled de facto by the rulers of Bohemia, right? Differently from Hungary, where you had the Arpads that more or less ruled over a sort of ethnic core land that they had made sort of royal property, and the various oligarchs dominated all around and or in within, but as again some sort of statelets on their own. The Przemyslids of Bohemia had simply always ruled over both Bohemia and Moravia. They had been actually fighting against one another, because when you actually go to rule in one place, it doesn't matter if you're the brother, the father, or whatever of the guy from the other side, still you need to rule there. And so at point this nobility will make you go at war, etc. But they were always just the same people, the same family, right? And this would be very important, because the lands definitely are different historically, but they also followed a common history of some sort. Then north, you go through the passes of the Sudeten Mountains, reaching finally the largely flat Baltic side of the watershed, so up to literally the sea. Like, there's not so much of a barrier, right? You find different valleys, the Oder, the Vistula, etc. But that's in fact another area that opens, that is a bit frontier for the same Bohemian power. In fact, we find here what are the other three Bohemian crown lands that literally form a sort of crown a bit around in the eastern part of the same Bohemia. So they depended on the Bohemian ruler. We are talking about the aforementioned Duchy of Silesia and the much smaller Margraviate of Upper and Lower Lusatia. The latter were historically formed, and I made a video about this, also speaking about the origins of the Serbs, the White Sorbs essentially, as a power, again, not just north of Bohemia, that had formed perhaps as a consequence of the migration era, with Iranian dynasts leading clans of Slavs, and eventually in later times moving further south to the Balkans in chunks. I discussed this all in the videos about Serbian history. We'll come back on that. In any case, I talk about the Alans, the Iranians, extensively as far as this migration in Western Europe is concerned. The Duchy of Silesia was the most interesting part, right? Not just because it was bigger, but it was also richer. As we will learn now, also the Bohemian lands were historically developed because of their mineral resources, right? That, especially from the later Middle Ages, had been providing a substantial amount of wealth for the local rulers. The problem with Silesia is not just that it lay from the other side of the mountains, but that from the other side it was also Poland that had at different times tried to, and actually controlled this land. And there had been wars between the two countries historically, not just for Silesia, but also against one another, especially in the very early days, that would concentrate eventually toward the end of the Middle Ages to Silesia. It was also very fragmented, and every part, there is still today, historically, a part of Silesia laying within the boundaries of Czech Republic. So that's evidently the indicator of such historical and political and cultural complexity of the area. And this land, as we will see now, was also more difficult to simply control because it pertained to, at least it fell under the sphere of influence of other powers, right, of other economical circuits, of other influences. And again, the local communities were always trying to preserve their own autonomies, their own customs, and it was quite complicated to simply reassert control on them because, in part, they were much more productive lands were to try to expand. There were also much greater problems in Germany for the Habsburgs. They were much more connected with, for not talking about the Turks or Hungary from the other side. So you can't be everywhere at the same time trying to curb what are the traditional prerogatives of these peoples in the first place, and that you actually can rule in virtue of the respect of the same. So you already have Bohemia and Moravia rendered relatively homogeneous by their mountainous insularity. Right? If you look at the map, it's just like it's a bulky thing, right? North of the Danube, that in between Germany, Poland, Austria, and even Hungary, because technically there was also a very hotly if not properly contested border, but say a frontier area where there had always been a lot of warfare going on between the same Bohemia and Hungary. Say Bohemia meant the Bohemian crown lands, right? In the crown lands of Hungary were also an even more composite than this, right? The official title of the Hungarian kings was something interminable for all the actual pieces of land controlled all around, with different communities, different rules and language and so on. In this sense, actually, the Bohemian crownlands were much more compact, again, historically. All right, and they, in this sense, had been functioned with relatively less problem. They were more westernized, they were more Germanized, and as a consequence, they also belonged a bit to this more Western world, even though Germany, again, is fundamentally Central Europe rather than else herself. These same monarchic standards of the crown lands were well defined historically. As a consequence, from a political institutional point of view, there hadn't been that process of, say, formal disgregation that had occurred to Hungary. Chiefly because it had been conquered and partitioned, but also because it had, again, been more privatistically fragmented from before, from the within. Silesia and these other lands, in fact, across the same mountain from Bohemia and Moravia, was a bit more diverse, right? It counted, again, the 16 feudal principalities, only 6 of which, by the way, were ruled directly from Vienna, right? Which, again, reflected this historical share of power with other monarchies on this region, that you couldn't simply quite even find the resources to centralize from. In the meanwhile, there were half a dozen princely families enjoying substantial law-making and judicial privileges in the traditional feudal guise, affording them various degrees of independence from Habsburgic rule. Welcome to the Ancien regime, and to, generally speaking, the say, traditional customs. You have these territories that, in theory, have a public value, because they have been founded by rulers that, in theory, regard them as personal possessions, as a sort of public domain. And good luck with that, because, of course, this throughout the Middle Ages had all fragmented and privatized further, as we've seen. And also the Habsburgs in their own Erblande knew something about this. But there were also, in fact, private dynasties, you can argue, that had matured within medieval law some private privileges that made them, in fact, some sort of dynastic states within this broader public circumscriptions. And needless to say, that we're also trying to win ever more autonomy, plus infiltrating with the public power of the country. Part they could be co-opted, but at the same time you still needed them locally, because they had lots of direct control on de facto in those lands. Near half of northern Lower Silesia was ruled, for example, by 2 largely autonomous native dynasties, the Piasts of Lignitz, Breg and Wohlau, and the Podebrads of Münsterberg and Oels. Finally, there even was in the south of Silesia a junior branch of the Hohenzollern dynasty, which ruled the Upper Silesian Duchy of Jägerndorf with the full status of imperial princes. This speaks volumes about what had happened in these lands, because essentially you have here a mix of even branches of the former ethnic royal dynasty of Poland, the Piasts, right, that ruled in Lignitz, and even again the chunks of other houses, princely houses of the empire, that aside, like the Hohenzollern, that were recognized such imperial status, like in the Holy Roman Empire, locally, and so essentially having this important power, owning even in a Dutch proper. This is fascinating because the Piasts had, again, gone from quite a while, but there were all these various branches as the dynasty had been historically more like a broader house, like a bit in the Kievan Rus, right? A sort of almost clanic formation that had scattered all the branches in all the various duchies that made up the broader kingdom, and that had eventually, married into other dynasties, in part survived, in part extinguished, and still holding this ancestral rights on these lands with a mentality that would really be beautiful to scope at some point. But the Polish Szlachta, always remembered this, was incredibly brutal in its sense of privilege and prestige, of separation from it. These were largely also agricultural areas. Even though Silesia was the most Germanized and thus the most advanced of the Polish historical provinces, so that this feudal mindset was radically ingrained to a level of violence that sometimes it's difficult to picture. Consider that the particularity of the Bohemian crownlands, as we will see now, is that they were also had also been heavily colonized by the Germans, right? There are ethnic maps that they show you quite clearly also in within the boundaries of Bohemia, Moravia. You have an outer layer of German prevalence and an inner layer of Czech one. The interesting aspect is that you could hardly distinguish these in practice, meaning that, of course, there were some different communities from others on the basis of this ethnic background, of their historical foundation, of the rights that all differ, right, within in fact, the Holy Roman Imperial deeply intricated system of law, and that, however, was mostly a matter of identification, right? If you spoke German, you were German, right? If you spoke Czech, you were Czech, right? You could have evident, originally ethnic names of the other ethnicity, but still being deeply connected with this sense of political identity. So this, of course, is a process that gets lost in the mists of time, because even from the migration era, you could hardly tell who was who in some ways. But still, the difference remains, and this is yet another important aspect, in my opinion, should be evaluated politically, institutionally, and I'm not going to digress on the, on the cultural or scientific relevance of this, but having studied the Middle Ages for decades now, I must confess that most of the initial sense of everybody was mixed, there was no way to tell the difference, well, especially in the migration era, and also in later times when these processes were regulating one another, in spite of the obvious hybrid that would emerge, there was still a significant distinction based on the fact that there weren't banally so many people. Right, so that even during the migration, yes, there were some areas like this one that were Slavicized because the prior occupants had largely moved out, right, and there was a cultural prevalence at some point coming from these other groups who was imposed politically and identitarily. So even the St. Hussite wars, etc., had been fought on the sense that, of course, there was at least an important legal distinction, because that was the only one that you could make in a political sense between the Czechs and the Germans, and a lot of that war was fought over it, right? Not for it, but over it, and it needs some sort of reevaluation, at least in the correct understanding of a very complexly shaded thing when it gets down to actual ethnicity, identity, and so on. In any case, the mid-14th century crisis had largely, in fact, recrystallized what had been established before. Right, the world had contracted demographically, economically. There was in a sense, an increased definition on the actual short-range territorial dimension. And the Bohemian crownlands had been providing, again, with a fundamentally neat example. The Czech-speaking majority included all of the nobility dominating central Bohemia and Moravia. Also because, let's be honest, these were the only people that actually mattered. We're talking always about aristocracies, right? The rest is peasants, right? You have burghers here and there, yes, but they are a staunch minority compared to the peasantry. Then you have a large German minority, again, holding sway over the mountainous periphery. And this aspect is also fascinating because unlike other places like in Poland, for example, where some of the most important cities were actually German, and I made a video about this, especially the one on the second half of the 14th century. You can find it in the medieval Polish playlist. The Czechs in the Bohemian crownlands had managed to essentially maintain the upper hand. This is what the Hussite wars had been fought, at least by the local nobility, in part for, again, maintaining that control, getting rid of a strong power at the top that was of foreign origin, and as such you could blame as foreign, right? But definitely not in a way, even at the time, that remotely resembles what happened in the 19th century with nationalism, socialism, etc. The nobility of Silesia and the Lusatias also spoke German, as did the majority at that point of Silesia's population. This also reflects, again, that Ostsiedlung mechanic we were talking about before, and it rendered, however, more complicated the rule for the Habsburgs, as well as through their essentially Bohemian center of control, right? Because of course, even that these were Silesians, they weren't feeling Austrians, definitely, and even though that area would historically be mostly about the Habsburgs, the general feeling was we are just probably even beyond, right? There is all the Bohemian, Moravian lands in between. And from the other side here, we behave differently, right? Silesia was not, however, fully German, right? It had, especially in Upper Silesia, a very large Polish minority, as well as even a small Czech population along the Bohemian frontier. This shaded the pattern further. The Lusatias were truly something on their own. Historically, culturally, identically, they were the home of the Sorbs, that were essentially Europe's smallest Slavic nation, and as such they are also relatively forgotten. But they truly had been surviving, in between, right? All the various mechanism, movements, again, from the other videos on the historical region series, we have seen how even the northeastern German marches were historically very, gradually expanding ones. We're actually the most depressed areas as well. So there, actually, we find the greatest proper hybrid between Germans and Slavs historically happening. Right, we were talking about it yesterday, just looking at the history of Schleswig-Holstein, right? Such different identity of the northern principalities was consequential enough, because until 1616, Silesia and the Lusatias had a German chancery in Breslau, which enjoyed a certain autonomy from the Bohemian government center in Prague, in responding the Habsburgs as well. This favored, indirectly, the further Germanization, at least in this political identity within the Holy Roman Empire, of the northern principalities, as opposed to what these places actually belong to, as crown lands, that is the Bohemia, right? So that together with Moravia were Czech, and as a consequence, or at least in importantly large quantity, and thus somehow fueling that sense of contrast between the center and the periphery, for which the periphery tends to autonomize, while the center, of course, to concentrate further. And there were tensions in that regard with neighboring powers that today we're not going to digress on, because it would be insane, but that were just at the door from the other side, and somehow, of course, interfering, infiltrating, and more. But from a political point of view, and more actually, there's a very complicated military history behind this too. As I was hinting at before, what made the Bohemian crown lands was that their mass, right? It was impressive. The human and economic wealth of this land was unsurpassed among the various Habsburgic possessions. In fact, in 1618, the Bohemian crown lands counted 4 million inhabitants, making them the monarchy's most populous component, as also one of Europe's most densely populated, which is interesting, because historically, it at least it depends on which part of Europe, but as we've just said, Central Europe is vast, right, and most of it is not so densely populated. So what actually happened in insight was that Bohemia had been recovering gradually, right? The world was somehow stepping forward, so that Bohemia did rank back against some of the most populated by European standards. It was not particularly high, but that Central Europe really didn't see much comparable aside from Germany and a few other areas. So this was again mostly an agricultural population. It goes without saying, but such dearth of rich soil had allowed the development of some manufacturing in all the aforementioned 4 crown lands, so that by the beginning of the 17th century, Greater Bohemia was also one of Central Europe's foremost producers of textiles, for example. Precious minerals, iron, silver, as much as 2/3 of Europe's tin was extracted from the mountains of Bohemia and Moravia. Prague had this important strategic function of center, right, that allowed, the transit for major resources of for example, the export to Germany of locally produced textiles and minerals, plus livestock and crops from more farming areas such as Austria, Hungary, Poland, that were ever more, especially Poland, exporting right abroad wheat, etc. Iron passed through Prague, coming from as far away as Styria, that, as we've seen, was also quite developed, speaking of mineral extraction. Silesia and the Lusatias were also fairly wealthy, right? The problem for the Habsburgs was rather the fact that they really belonged to other circuits that were difficult to simply bend to solely the Habsburgic favor, and so most of their interest. Although Silesia was, for example, Hungary's principal suppliers of finer textiles, so with an important intertwinement that could help connect and better these to Habsburgic-dominated lands, much of the Silesian communication routes were oriented along the Oder and Neisse rivers, connecting the land much more easily to Saxony, Brandenburg, and Poland than the rest of the Habsburgic monarchy. And this was not historically to change much. Of course, there would be, wars in the 18th century, as you know, to over the control of Silesia from Prussia, in fact, and the same Austria. During the 16th century, Ferdinand I and his imperial successors fundamentally relied on a greater scale on their Bohemian patrimony income than most of their other revenue, right? This gives you a scale of how important the Bohemian crown lands as a whole really poured in the Habsburgian coffers, because they were historically one of the most politically compact countries since the Middle Ages, as opposed even to southeastern Germany, from which the Habsburgs had been building their power from. And this tells you quite clearly, as it happened also many other times in history, how it's not much the size that matters, but the quality, right? And those who get ruled, as we will see now, not just simply supine to the Habsburgs in this regard, but of course they had lost the chance for a national monarchy quite long before, and fundamentally this more machinously feudal system that the Habsburgs had managed to put together in their Alpländer was enough, right, considered military power as opposed to just wealth, to simply control this territory. Everything is very complex. Again, we should make an entire video explaining how that control literally worked, also from a strategic point of view, and with all the, say, international relations of the case. But the system did work, right? The Bohemian resources allowed the Habsburgs effectively to pull it off, right? Even in their moments of further disgregation in the second half of the 16th century, a moment in which, in fact, the dynasty was not so important as it had been half a century before, even in just the Austrian branch, was due to this crown lands. What did these lands, however, require in exchange, right, for their subjection? Of course, an important degree of political autonomy, right? You can argue there was a much greater potential in all these lands, indeed. And as we've seen, Bohemia was not even particularly more advanced than other parts of the country, but it was, say, more compact. In any case, this allowed them to also resist more further exploitation. The Habsburgs were quite careful in this sense, from a political point of view, to leave untouched the autonomous treasuries that collected the revenues of each crown land. In other words, all the collections were somehow negotiated from a political point of view rather than directly extracted by people who simply worked for them, right? This was, again, as in the normal, traditional sense at the time, really, these were countries that had always been administrating themselves by themselves, right? This was present everywhere, was the norm. So in order to come there and say, well, we would like to, start say, governing by essentially entering the administrative system and just collecting what we want, it was just unthinkable everywhere. But basically people are obsessed with who dominated whom, who conquered whom. But very often people forget that the entire point is that all the countries govern themselves by themselves, right? And that only in, say, colonial context and or other ones where you had literally crushed any political or institutional reality, you could simply dictate rule. The rest in Europe was all about negotiating with essentially the establishment that ruled the country by itself. And so as a ruler, you were just somebody, coping with that. The Habsburgs also honored the indigenous nobility's right to fill government positions with native-born officials, which was also the thing. They wanted people on their own, and these were normally elected, ideally, right? Of course, the way this function was very impositive as far as the majority of the population went, that didn't have much saying in the system. There were just a handful of, let's say, major, let's say, houses that had something to say specific about how this mechanism worked, because essentially they had managed to dominate large amounts of the population, and their saying was the saying of that system. And in many ways it was a functional one, at least from the perspective of those who worked for these people, meaning that they had lost largely their personal autonomy from a long time. So the sense that that guy was your lord and was working for those lands, those communities, was enough at a point to support them. In a world of hoax, robber barons and brigands, etc. The central executive office was the Bohemian court chancery that was staffed by Czech-speaking noblemen, answering to the estates and residing in the castle of Prague, right, which formed a sort of effective word on its own. I made a video about Walpurgisnacht by Meyring that actually he goes a bit this divide between the nobility and the rest, probably of the nether city, right, aside from the castle. And if the residence of the Habsburg kings was just 200 miles away in Vienna, right, it was properly another parallel government that responded to the former and again made things work in this negotiational dimension. The Bohemian estates enjoyed more than the extensive legislative and administrative powers that we have seen also in the video about the Alpländer. In fact, the most important thing about them was that the say Bohemia as such, right, Bohemia proper, just the original core land, had the traditional right of electing a king for all the crown lands upon the death of each monarch, naturally. And this was generally following as the order, right? The rights and privileges were confirmed by the ruler, who at that point was receiving green light by the estate to say, okay, we will accept, your guy as long as our rights are respected, right? This is how it worked. Like, it was all in the hands of the estates, of this sort of mini-states that ruled privately and through their privileges, etc. And a king was made, and at this point it's the Habsburgs, also for obvious reasons, for the necessity of Bohemia to be defended, to be part of this broader power that had reached, as we've seen, a regional dimension, was one of the largest in Europe, in spite of all its quite machinous governmental system, which the same Bohemia was, to which the same Bohemia was contributing that complexity degree. So during the Hussite Wars, at the beginning of the 15th century, Bohemia had refused to elect its late king's heir. This had prevented him from assuming the throne for 17 years, right? And the matter was solved until the Bohemian ruler and the Pope had those demands for special concessions recognized by the estates. That's how, in fact, the monarchy had collapsed, right? As we were saying before, there wasn't much that could be done to recover the power that had existed at the time of Charles IV of Luxembourg, and as a consequence, the system had decentralized, autonomized further, but also lost great part of its autonomy internationally. And that's what, again, the privates were aiming at, right? Having their own small kingdom on their own, but the broader one actually sinking, or if not vaporizing, because it could still confirm these people's privileges. It was useful in that sense. Could be given to somebody else, as long as somebody else, of course, was not pressuring these people too much. And of course, all these countries were all very pressured in general, so they tried to cooperate intensively. In spite of the decline of the monarchy, as we've seen, at least the native one, the late medieval crisis, and so the collapse, of course, of large parts of the public structures, etc., had, paradoxically, through feudalization and the reinforcement of oligarchic positions that had matured at that point, their new place on the scene, considered that there had been all the new riches hour, right? The Hussite revolt basically took away the flower of Bohemian nobility, right, and elite, and just pretty obscure people emerged, and everybody got much poorer in the process, and it was that of a mess. But those who had at least achieved this sort of result, from their perspective, began to at least entrench further in these prerogatives, and this had objectively reinforced for example, the use of Czech language from an institutional point of view, right? Among naturally the Bohemian and Moravian ruling elite that de facto control, say, most things within the Bohemian crownlands, in spite of the fact, as we've seen, that many were very autonomous even from them historically and culturally. But there was overall, of course, within all this negotiable space that happened at every level, a sort of sense, growing awareness, like this happens pretty much all over Europe, of the sort of national feeling of this country, like the fact that, again, when universalism had died, Europe had fragmented, and it had done so on this sort of pre-existing basis. And as we've seen, the Bohemian one was, from feudal times, substantially strong, large as a monarchy. So even when this sunk, that sort of spot remained, right, for these people to stand on, and to, in fact, reinforce their sense of distinctiveness, independence from the Austrian, the German, and the Hungarian dominions, right? And so from the Habsburgs themselves, that were still seen again as the external rulers called just to defend their prerogatives that pre-existed him, and that the sense were the main issue over which most of the political battles were fought, not just the political ones, by the way. So this is the comprehensive picture. It's very conceptual, but it's important to state it, because it as we will see, Hungary worked in a very different way, because you have to understand more or less what this war was about in general, right, and what kind of forces agitated within it, also, and much with pre-existing realities and how they had come to be historically, etc. Right. So, likely next time we'll talk about Hungary. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time.